Thank you to everyone joining us today from across the country and around the world. I'm Kim Todd, Virtual Programs Manager here at Conscious Capitalism, Inc. On behalf of the entire CCI team, we appreciate you taking the time to learn and grow in community with us. Today, we are joined by Daryl Brewster, CEO of Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose, and Katherine Bostick, an independent consultant and senior advisor to CECP, for a discussion moderated by Ritse Erumi, program officer with the Ford Foundation. Their discussion today will focus on the findings from CECP's recent report, Frontline Worker Wellbeing in a Time of Crisis, and Ways to Support Essential Workers. As many of you know, conscious capitalism is a philosophy that emphasizes the human nature of business, as well as a movement of business leaders from around the world, working to change the practice and perception of capitalism as a means to elevate humanity. Conscious Capitalism, Inc. is a nonprofit organization dedicated to catalyzing that movement by creating learning opportunities like today's session, and building systems of support for practicing conscious capitalists through our Senior Leader Network membership. Several times a month, we are offering these virtual gatherings as a way for the community to see how this philosophy takes shape in the leadership journeys and the business practices of those in our network. Today's gathering will run for about 45 minutes. Ritse will be in conversation with Daryl and Katherine for about 30 minutes, and then we'll transition to audience questions during the last 10 to 15 minutes of our session. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can during our time together. If you have any technical questions or issues, please email us at info@consciouscapitalism.org. And before we begin today, we'd love to find out just a little bit more about who is attending. If you could please complete the poll that we're going to launch here. You'll see that on your screen soon. And just fill out, let's see. There we go. If you could just let us know a little bit more about yourself, that would be great. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We are really excited to be joined by Ritse Erumi. She is a program officer on the Future of the Workers team at the Ford Foundation. She leads Ford's work on advancing more fair economies through new approaches to technology and innovation, narrative change, and business engagement. We are also joined by the CEO of Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose, Daryl Brewster, an independent consultant and senior advisor to CECP, Katherine Bostick, who was instrumental in the research and production of CECP's report. We're really excited to join you here today and look forward to the discussion. Ritse, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Kim. I would like to start off by thanking you and the Conscious Capitalism team for putting on this amazing conference and for providing a platform to talk about the population that is core to what we do here at Ford, which are frontline workers. I'm also excited to be in conversation with Daryl and with Katherine. So I think we should just jump in, since we have a limited time. Katherine, I'm going to turn to you because you served as the primary author of this report, and would love to just see if you can provide us with a brief overview of the report and what you hope to achieve with this work.
Great, well, thanks so much. And I just first like to echo your thanks to Conscious Capitalism for the opportunity to share with this audience, and also thanks to Ford and CECP for the opportunity to lead this work. And this work really set out to understand how companies have supported their frontline workforce over the past 2 years during COVID-19, and how the events of that period really influenced their approaches to human capital management. Our focus was looking in the United States in primarily the food, beverage, and consumer staples sectors, and focusing mostly on those frontline jobs that are a little bit more behind the scenes. So the folks who are working in processing, manufacturing, warehousing, distribution. A lot was done earlier in the pandemic thinking about folks who were more consumer facing in some of these sectors. That said, I think that our lessons learned from this work are really broadly applicable. And we really wanted to identify and amplify the better practices and explore how those better practices can support not just worker well-being into the future, but also corporate resilience.
Thank you. You know, at Ford, we were really drawn to this work because we, have felt that the pandemic has shown something that we have long known, and it's that workers are the engine of our economy. And we can see that with the labor shortages and some of the supply chain challenges that we are experiencing and really feel more broadly. So Daryl, I'd love to just turn to you and to really ask and understand why CECP thought that this was an important topic to cover at this time.
Great. Well, and again, thanks to Conscious Capitalism for hosting this, and thanks to you, Ritse, and the team at Ford Foundation for really being an inspiration around this effort, and Katherine for all the work that you've done. And we're really delighted to have been a part of this effort. At CCP, our corporate purpose, our purpose is to empower the world's leading companies to be a force for good in society, and that starts with your employees. Whether you call it your colleagues, your teams, but that group that you're really working around in an organization. And I think the pandemic spotlighted the importance not only of employees overall, those of us who get to sit down at work and do Zoom calls, but also those in the front line who stand up at work day in and day out, didn't have a choice about where they went to work. You had to go to the place where the work got done. And I think it was an opportunity for us to really think, we cheered at 7 o'clock every evening in New York for the healthcare workers, but there were millions of others who were actually out there on the shop floor, driving trucks to get us the products to deliver the services that we all needed, assuming they had jobs. And so we're excited to really see a focus on frontline workers, over 60 million of them here in America. Disproportionately women, about 2/3 women, and people of color, about half people of color, as a group that sometimes we've just kind of forgotten about. So we were delighted to work with the Ford Foundation and the support of that, and with Katherine to produce this. And we've seen that not only this is about the frontline workers, which is key, but it's in companies' best interest as well to have a good, engaged frontline workforce.
Thank you so much for that. And that would be the institutional answer. So could you talk to me about why this is personal? Why, what brought you to this work as individuals?
Yeah, I'll start on that, Katherine. This is personal. My dad worked and started his career, and we didn't call it a career back then. And the night shift at RCA in Harrison, making TV tubes, a business that's since gone away. I helped pay my way through college, driving a beer truck for Anheuser-Busch out of the Newark brewery by the Newark airport. So this is stuff I've seen and have friends who've been in that area and had the privilege and the honor to run a number of companies in the restaurant industry and in the food industry that had lots of frontline workers who were really key to what we did. And I learned a lot from Jim Donald. Jim Donald was a former CEO of Starbucks. Had grown up in the grocery industry. Today, he is the co-chair of Albertsons. Albertsons is a big supermarket chain with Safeway and King's and Albertsons supermarkets all over the country. And Jim is really one of the best CEOs around frontline workers. 98% of the workers at Albertsons, 300,000 workers, 98% of those are in the front line. And Jim has a great line. Sometimes in companies, we think about frontline workers as just objects, and the term is headcount. We have to reduce headcount or change headcount. And Jim had a great line. This is not about headcount. This is about heads that count. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, has been really meaningful to me. And as I was preparing my remarks today, oddly enough, I was eating this cereal here, Great Grain cereal. And that came to us from the workers when I had Post Cereals was part of my group in Battle Creek, Michigan, invented by those on the front line who figured out if we mixed products together, we could have a great taste sensation. And I've seen it throughout my career, the innovation that people can really bring in this area. And I think as we saw pre-pandemic, there were challenges around demographics. Pandemic just brought those and really exacerbated that issue. And there's really just an opportunity for us here to identify, to amplify best practices, to put the kind of focus on frontline workers that we have on the rest of our human capital within the organization. Jobs that are well-being, jobs that are important for our group and important for our society as well.
Thank you so much for that. Katherine, do you have any perspective?
Sure. I think, from my perspective, I was really excited to do this work in that I've spent my entire career really focused on understanding the impacts across supply chains for many different commodities and many different production systems, and then using markets to uplift the people and protect the places that are traditionally disadvantaged or impacted in our current systems. A lot of my career was spent at World Wildlife Fund and Fairtrade USA, and working on certification systems to kind of uplift people in places through that type of system. But part of that is really about understanding what's happening on the ground and figuring out how can others at more the buying end of the supply chain do something about it. And so that's really the corporate end. I think we all know that COVID-19 exacerbated the existing inequalities across society related to race and ethnicity and gender and socioeconomic status, and that the corporate support measures for workforces during the pandemic were so important for these individuals who are otherwise already kind of disadvantaged via societal inequalities. And I personally believe that companies have a moral imperative to act responsibly. And I also believe, and I have seen evidence, that doing good in this way can be good for business. And so that's really what drew me to doing this work. Thank you for that.
I'd like to turn to the actual report. Daryl, someone who has had to walk, led several companies and are often in the place where you're having to make critical decisions. What would be the kind of most critical takeaways from this report and this body of work for you?
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent question as we go through. And it really had three broad findings that I think are really important for companies both at a moral, but also at a strategic business level. And I think these things are hand in hand as we go forward. First is that when we look at the demographics of those who are in frontline worker jobs, the impact, which was already below what the needs were. When you exacerbate that with a pandemic and add on the challenges around social justice, we really saw just increased intensity and focus on frontline workers. Again, as I say, the people who have to stand up at work, who didn't get to have all the fun of Zoom calls, right? That we all have experienced here. And we were delighted to see more than half of our companies that we surveyed have made major changes in terms of how they were working with frontline workers. So we weren't in a good space. Some of that was COVID related. Some was just where we had not paid as much attention to those as we had in the past. Second area is that companies were finding value in doing that. It helped them attract employees. It helped them retain employees and upskill employees for the long haul at a time when there was a shortage of workers. Lack of immigration coming into the nation, just demographic trends were such that you really couldn't find people. And then the issues around safety, childcare, and others just really made that a big challenge. And so we're also really pleased to see that 2/3 of companies, the actions they have taken, they have decided to keep those as permanent actions across the enterprise. So those, I think, are really important findings. It's important. People have taken action. The third, and I think we'll hear more about that, is the opportunity to do more. I don't think we found any companies that didn't do something as a result of this. That just makes everybody did something, but nobody did everything. And so we think there's some real specific areas which we'll come to that companies could capitalize and take advantage of in kind of a pre-competitive way. We can all learn from each other here about how we really engage with our frontline workers to really have them be a part of our organizations and a critical part of society.
Thank you so much for that. Katherine, I'd like to turn to you in part because you, not only did you write this report, you conducted the research. So you were in there speaking to leaders and who are grappling with these issues. So we'd love to hear kind of what you could add to this. What were sort of the takeaways that you'd want to be front and center for other leaders in this space?
Definitely. I think, I certainly agree with everything Daryl just said, and putting a little more meat to that. I think there's no real surprise in terms of what the best practices in corporate response to COVID were. None of it's rocket science. It was critically important to be engaging workers in the identification of challenges and solutions, obviously implementing strong health and safety protocols, providing paid leave, and in particular paid sick leave. There was a lot of conversation about that. And then financial assistance, and another one that was a little less common, but critically important for a lot of workers, was getting some support around backup dependent care, whether that was financial support or literally helping them find somewhere to leave their children. And strong and clear communication emerged as a clear, important best practice throughout and implementing all of that. I think we do know, as I was saying, that these best practices are especially important for workers who are people of color or women or those who are already struggling financially. We know from the CDC that BIPOC individuals were hit harder by COVID. Black and African American persons, Hispanic and Latino, American, Indian, and Alaska Natives faced hospitalization rates of something like 3 to 3.5 times higher than that of whites. The work that companies do around open communication and non-retaliation policies are really critically important for Black workers, in that those workers were more than twice as likely as their white peers to experience retaliation if they raised health and safety concerns related to COVID in the workplace. And then we also know that, the lion's share of family care falls on women. It's still a reality today, and that paid leave and flexibility of shift schedules are essential for working mothers. And studies found that working mothers reduced working hours 4 to 5 times more than working fathers. And the Department of Labor actually just released a great fact sheet on women and occupational segregation during COVID. And they noted in that as early as April 2020, a month after really everything shut down, women's labor force participation was at a 35-year low. So this really had a true impact on women. I think we also found in the research and a lot of our conversations that the companies are really thinking a lot about how do they better attract and retain talent. As Daryl mentioned, there is a labor shortage, and that was exacerbated by COVID. And so they are really thinking about not just rethinking recruitment, but job design, their employee value propositions, and honing in on what is meaningful for workers in their specific labor markets, and that's not going to be the same everywhere. And our colleagues at Gallup and EmployBridge did research where they found that of course, wage levels is an important factor for frontline and blue collar workers, but stability of pay, paid time off, shift schedule and flexibility, safety, of course, and even that sense of purpose and dignity come out as really important factors when people are thinking about taking or keeping a job. And we heard a lot from our interviews about the importance of communicating clearly with workers or potential workers about what your corporate employee value proposition was for those workers. Lastly, I just say that we can speak a little bit more about this later, but that communication was highlighted as being a clear challenge, and yet it also was highlighted as being critically important to helping companies weather the pandemic. And that's communication, not just to frontline workers, but hearing from them as well.
Great. Thank you for that. I'm curious about, if you found anything surprising or if there were any findings that were unexpected.
Yeah, maybe not surprising, but just crystal clear came out was the critical and trusted role that business and employers played in terms of information sharing and the communication that Katherine talked about. In a world where we're dealing with a 24-hour news cycle where you think there was a different world going on one station than another station, the CDC changing things as they got more science and learning in, it was pretty confusing for everybody out there. But employers were one you could kind of trust because there was generally common interest, not always, but generally common interest with that. The Edelman Trust Barometer has come out and shown that while trust in government has fallen during COVID, it fell even further among media. The trust among business went up, and among my employer, the people I work with that I know, it went up even higher because people could understand that. And I think companies that did a good job with that, communicating in the right language and the right vehicles in the right way, really made an impact because they were able to share relevant information, why it was in everybody's best interest of this working community, if you will, could share resources that could help people and support them during this incredible time that we've gone through over the last couple of years. So that role of the employer as being so critical, I think, was one of the in a sense, pleasant surprises, but an added obligation and responsibility of the employer.
Yeah, I really agree with that, Daryl. And I think, we can all relate to that struggle at the beginning of the pandemic in particular, just trying to understand what is happening and what should we do to keep ourselves and our families safe. And I do think that the checklist on paper of what did companies do to keep their employees safe is one thing, but there are these more subtle things they did in terms of the role of the employer in helping workers navigate this complex space shouldn't be underestimated and isn't necessarily a thing that can be evaluated in an easy checkbox. I mean, I think, one of the companies we talked about how what they realized one of the needs of their workforce was that they couldn't figure out if their schools were open or closed or their daycares were open or closed. And a lot of them, English was not their first language. So they, basically helped their workforce understand whether schools were open or not and put that information in a language their workers could understand. So things like that are not quite the big, the big gestures, but the little gestures that really helped people meet a need.
Right. Yeah, I mean, a few of the other examples we heard were, headquarters staff or executives working on the front line with frontline workers when there were shortages of employees, et cetera. Just really kind of powerful ways to understand what people were going through. Companies that brought nurses in at the shift change, both to take temperature, but also to help people in their language understand the mental health challenges that not only they have, but also their families, their communities were going through. We talked to a company that had that offered coupons so that people could go out to restaurants that were going out of business, so that they could actually use those products so they could keep the community really strong and going, and really ensuring communication worked in a multi-language in the vehicles that people could have in a two-way street. So you're listening to what was happening as well as acting on this.
Thank you. We are increasingly opening up, the economy is open for business. So I'd really like to get to what I often describe as the so what, all right? How, do these findings, what you've learned, how can we think about what should be in place, to build resilience, for, workers, but also businesses as we look to reopen across the US?
Yeah, a few thoughts, I think, and solutions that we're kind of seeing. I think at the high level, it's sort of clear. Employees are pretty much a critical part of any organization, but especially that focus on the front line, which sometimes got forgotten. Look at the front line almost as a commodity that we can, switch and change, move people as we want. But I think that importance of really understanding that dignity we talked about, heads that count, not just head count. And I think having, therefore, a frontline worker integrated strategy that connects all aspects and elements of the business really kind of critical. And using kind of the innovation skills that companies have in sharing their goods and services with their customers and applying those also to their workforce. Ed Bastian, the CEO of Delta, talked about that. We need as much innovation as we engage with our employee base as we do in providing goods and services that we've had. And I think specifically, and I think a lot of this comes, as Katherine shares in the report, it's Maslow's hierarchy. First, make sure you're safe. Give people safe conditions and a winning employee value proposition, which we talked about. Why should I be here? We always would do that with our customers. We need to do the same thing with our employee base. Second area is to communicate. We've talked a lot about that two-way communication, listening, connecting, understanding where the issues are. They're not exactly what people as they say, the people in the suits in the offices, who of course were on Zoom calls, what they think they are. We need to understand this idea of stability of work, areas like that, really, really important to key workforce. And then the other is to kind of innovate and integrate on an enterprise-wide basis. So that each of the departments are really connecting and working together around that overall corporate sense of purpose. That this is an area where we can make enormous progress on diversity, equity, and inclusion because it's a more diverse workforce to start with. And can we find pathways for people who are in those kind of roles to be upskilled, to build careers at companies, and to build careers at companies? There's Barbara Humpton, who's on our board, interviews a guy named Corey Scales, who started out in a facility. He was working on the front line, 22 years at Siemens Corporation, ends up now as the factory head in their Grand Prairie, Texas facility. Great little video to kind of share, but how people can build careers, give people hope in these roles and jobs. I think that's another element that comes out of that. They don't all have to have gone to the fancy schools and all the rest. There's lots of opportunities for people who know the company, know the business, to grow in those roles.
Katherine, do you have any perspective on that?
Yeah, so I think just, diving into a little bit more detail on some of what Daryl was talking about in terms of that sort of at that base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I think it's, as we're opening up, it's a little bit tempting to say, okay, great, we're moving past this and just move forward. But I think it is really important to look back and for companies to specifically look back and review the efficacy of their pandemic health and safety protocols. And to the extent that people want to have a conversation and really engage in pre-competitive opportunities related to ensuring that their workplace is safe and accessible, talk about what did we learn? How do we measure improvements and benefits of those protocols? And I think, it's a good time to be doing a little bit of a retrospective there. Similarly, Daryl was talking about the employee value proposition, and I raised that earlier. And I think taking a comprehensive look at that and how it is understood by your frontline workers is really important. Obviously, wages, a lot of companies are currently reviewing wages in this tight labor market. But COVID also reminded many workers of the value of paid sick leave and paid family leave. Traditionally, this type of job, something like Gallup and others state that fewer than half of lower wage workers have access to sick leave, even when working full time. And so I think that's something we all need to take a close look at. And what does our society value, and how can and how did having sick leave benefit companies in this case in terms of stopping the spread of COVID-19 in their facilities. And I also think in terms of that employee value proposition, as Daryl was talking about, really companies taking a close look at tangible benefits related to things like career advancement, on-the-job training, tuition reimbursement, but also those benefits that are a little bit less tangible. What can you offer in terms of shift flexibility? A lot of the frontline workforce is seeing, suddenly office workers have this degree of flexibility that they've never had before now that everyone's working from home. And some people love it and some people hate it, obviously. But I think that it is something that frontline workers are asking, well, how can I too have some flexibility in my job, even though I have to go into my workplace? And I think that, that's another piece that companies can and say they are taking a look at of how do you address that in this different working environment.
Right.
Good.
Good
stuff.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think I'm just going to say that I really appreciate the focus on just kind of what does equity look like across the board, because I think one of the big divides has been kind of what those who are able to work from home and who are able to stay safe or had access to, and then what it meant for our frontline workers. So really thinking about that. Daryl, I'd just be curious, do you have any sort of examples that you have seen more broadly that kind of illustrate some of this?
Yeah, I think these crisis situations do create lots of innovations. Necessity is the mother of invention. I mean, it creates all these new areas. A few of the things I think we saw and we've seen across CECP for companies, business at Freshpet established a Freshpet Academy, so that people not only did you have nurse on hand, but people could actually see how they could have a career progression in frontline workers. At higher increases with upskilling of opportunities, upskilling of jobs, how they could move up through the ranks. And in their case, a different type of equity, but also then provided shares in the company for everybody who was there for X number of times. So they could all be owners together of the organization. I think a great example, I'm proud to serve on the board of the company, and named this academy after the head of HR who passed away from COVID a month in. Right, so a huge shock to the organization, but use that as a way to what would Don have done, kind of an approach. Another group where I saw were a bunch of auto dealers who were struggling to find technicians to be able to work in their facilities, collaborated, bought an old school together, and actually provided pre-competitive training. So they collaborated on a community basis to create the jobs where they saw them happening, which wasn't happening traditionally in the educational system. There was an efficiency for all to kind of work together. Or others who've done that with childcare centers. 50% of our workers do not have access to childcare. This is why we've seen this huge reduction in women in the workforce. But can companies come together? They can run it themselves, or do a bunch of them come together to help put childcare groups in place. Another thing, I think it's in the text, is the group at Gallup. Gallup asked all the political polling questions, came up with 5 simple questions. 5 questions you can ask your organization to see if it's a sustainable organization. Is it a place where people want to be? It's in the chat where people can take advantage of those areas. And the one other I'll just mention, we did have Darren Walker from the Ford Foundation and Marty Walsh, Secretary of Labor, on for a CEO call a couple of months ago. And Secretary of Labor, I think he wasn't sure what he was doing, but he actually gave out his cell phone number. We were told we can't give that anymore. But several CEOs took him up on it. And one in particular, who I happen to know in the construction industry, said he's had half a dozen calls, and they figured out now how to help develop federally backed training programs in inner city use to get into the trades in the construction industry. So really interesting examples that might not have happened elsewhere. The challenge is, how do we keep those going here as we move forward?
Mhm. That's great.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in and build a little bit on the Gallup Sustainability 5 that Daryl was just talking about. I think it's a good example of a useful tool that can be used as companies, lean into efforts to improve communication and build their worker voice. And this was, that topic was a huge topic in our interviews, both in terms of how communication is the basis of trust in a time of crisis and how it can be really hard to communicate. In particular, some of the challenges that were raised was that the frontline worker access to and familiarity with technology can be different than that of an office worker who's on email all day. Some people aren't allowed to bring cell phones into their workplace due to food safety, for example. And so, a lot of these frontline workplaces are also multilingual and multicultural, and every workplace is going to need a slightly different solution, but employee engagement efforts, a lot of companies do that with their office workers, and this idea of expand that to your frontline workforce. And it might need to be in a slightly different format or done in a slightly different way, but you can still ask questions and benchmark trends on which workforce perceptions. And the Gallup Sustainability 5 is a great kind of core set of questions that you could add a few more to. And one company we talked about how they implement surveys one question at a time. So it's, once a week or a couple days a week, when the employees clock in, there's a tablet and they're asked one question. And so everyone answers that question on their way into work at that shift. Another facility told us that there are cell phones allowed in their facility, and they use QR codes around the facility so that workers can scan that QR code and answer a question or put in a comment. If they see, say, a health and safety concern, they can flag it and it's tagged to that location in the facility. Other kind of less one-off kind of survey tools people talked about was using focus groups. Another company actually talked about how they thought it was really critical. They were catching workers who were leaving. They were doing exit interviews with every worker, and asking them why they were leaving, and trying to create a clear open space for them to be honest about that. So that's how they were hearing, oh, I'm leaving for a slightly better salary, or maybe there's better benefits somewhere else. And I think learning why are people leaving can give you some incentive of what might you need to change to get them to stay, right? And I think one last example is that a company talked about how they had multiple production facilities, and that they were really working to create a culture of learning across those facilities. So they were bringing together over Zoom the HR managers and plant managers from each of those facilities so that they could talk and learn from each other. So maybe one facility had implemented a solution related to communication and engagement with the workforce, and they could share that with the others. And so it created a space of, create a culture of learning across the company.
Well, I know that there's just so much to be said, about this, but I want to make sure that we can open up for some questions. So I will invite Kim, you're back on. So want to just make sure that we speak to the questions that you're holding as having heard, what came out of this report.
Thanks so much for the discussion and the great insight. There is a question from James, who is wondering what the role of community colleges are playing in partnering with businesses.
Katherine, do you want to start, or I'll jump into it?
I'll start, and you can build out. I think you have some more examples of this than I do, but I think one of the other recommendations in the report, this question really speaks to it, is about engaging with the communities in which you operate. And that by engaging with those communities, you can really better, help identify talent pools, you can build partnerships for skills development. And that's clearly kind of partnering with local community colleges is a great way to, build partnerships on skills development and, creating a pipeline. And I think, Daryl, you probably have some examples of this.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great area. Our traditional school system, generally ages out at 18. In some cases, if kids don't make it that long, at 16. Community colleges have so much more flexibility. They're there. They can really provide some insights to kids to can help, and also tend to engage even more with the business community where the jobs will be. So there's a goal there of not only getting the educational benefits, but also the specific skills that you might have to really do that. So we've seen a lot of examples, regional collaborative efforts, where a number of companies will get together with community groups to provide some of that training in some of those development areas. We're seeing technology. IBM has a program called P-Tech, which is used both at community college and also other schools, that helps to really train people for the jobs of the future. And those jobs, you may not work for a digital company, but you're going to use digital skills. So what do those kind of look like that groups can kind of work out with? And even beyond, community colleges, a company, Southwire in West Carrollton, Georgia, and they actually put, for kids who were dropping out of school, a classroom in their factory. So in the morning, kids could get the schooling they needed. In the afternoon, they could help on the line, and just to get them an understanding of what was happening as being to get a workforce and get a job. But the community college thing, and it varies, there's lots of different examples around the country, but is a really powerful group to tap into, has a lot often more flexible, more adaptable than the more traditional school systems are. And companies, I think, have found some real success, particularly around these frontline worker type place-based jobs. The kind of things you can learn about, you can't learn about necessarily on Zoom. You kind of got to be there. And so I think it's an area that companies can really look at. And also important for companies to take responsibility in this, right? You can't say, what's the education system's fault? Well, then step in, and what are you going to do about it? Right. And that's one of the things Stu Thorne, the former CEO at Southwire, that he really started. He said, let's stop complaining and start being part of the solution, like you would in any other part of business. So that, I think, that mentality can go a long way.
And I would just add, I think, we've definitely also heard about companies that are offering tuition reimbursement, and sometimes they're focusing on the local community colleges as encouraging, having the tuition reimbursement be an option for those schools in order to help their workers continue their education there.
Yeah. And it builds on Catherine's point that most of the roles we're talking about in Frontline are place-based. They're in a place. I mean, it's not a choice of whether you go to the office or not. You have to go to the facility or to the truck, as I did at Anheuser-Busch. You've got to actually physically be there. And that lends to a lot more community engagement. So how do you really work with community leaders, the types of jobs in those areas? And we're working in a few different communities with different companies that are really looking at how you can tackle that workforce development for not just the jobs of today, but the jobs of the future. So how do we make sure this is a continued education program? I don't know about you, but things have changed since I started working. We used to use SuperCalc to do our spreadsheets. Email, that's kind of crazy. All these developments, and if anybody thinks they're done, these are going to continue to grow. But how do we make sure that we're kind of partners with the communities on a business and a collaborative basis and other ways, so that we can continue to help advance our workforce into the jobs of the future? And that gap on STEM education has grown, and it's a real opportunity for businesses to kind of step up, either individually or collectively, or in partnership with government, local officials, community colleges being one of the best ways to do so.
And in your experience, is it beneficial for a business to go to a community college with ideas in mind of what they need, or let the community college figure out what they'd like to teach?
Yeah, my sense is the answer is yes. But I think what can be really helpful is if a number of companies can get together. And I had the example of the auto industry. These are auto dealers who couldn't get people together, that they were able to get together and had a larger voice than any one particular. Now, these tended to be smaller or mid-sized companies. Many of the companies we work with, CECP, are much, much larger than that, and who can do it differently. But they all came together, identified, here's a need, went to places and said, okay, we can see what the unemployment rates look like, et cetera. There's a community need as well, which is to find jobs and then see how you can work those things out. And it does require collaborative skills. Some companies are better at that than others. At our community colleges, and having the kind of the right leaders and people working on those things collectively to come up with good solutions. So I think it's both ways, but companies I don't think can just sit on the sideline and say, where are our workers? Well, if that's your question, you need to be part of that solution. So how do you reach out? Do you put a school, with support of the local school system, do you put a classroom in your factory? What are those creative opportunities that would be natural to think about as you're looking at consumer propositions and others? We need that same mindset as we think about our frontline workers.
I think one thing I'll just add to that is that, at Ford, as we think about sort of jobs more broadly and how they relate to a thriving economy, that there's one piece around sort of the skill up, for jobs, making sure that, people have the skills to do the jobs that are available and the jobs of the future. But there's also a piece around job quality, so things you could skill people up, but if the quality of the jobs is low, we don't have that thriving sort of economy. And I think that was really at the heart of kind of what we saw as the challenges lifted up within this report, that there are ways to, there are the workers who want to do these jobs. Let's ensure that these jobs are quality jobs, that there is health and safety protocols in place, that there are these different support mechanisms that touch on, this Maslow's hierarchy to ensure that the workers are able to show up and do their best work. And so just want to, highlight the job quality piece of the equation here.
For sure. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, building on that we heard a lot from the companies we spoke with about how they're trying to expand their talent pools. And part of that is really having to understand what are the barriers for those different populations that need to be addressed to make work for them. And sometimes that's there's populations that are more concerned about health and safety. There were folks talking about how they wanted to get partially retired individuals to come back to work. And it's like, okay, well, the older population is a little bit frightened of working in person during a pandemic, right? They're more susceptible to COVID. What do you need to do to get them comfortable with coming back and keep them safe? Same thing for folks who might need shift flexibility, for example, or they might need a different type of skills training. So really, both this skills training and job quality are critically important to reach the full talent pool and to really make work for everyone.
Yeah. So, the points are so right on. And, one of the things we've seen from companies is to have the executives or managers go out and actually work a day in those facilities, see what it's like. See where the dangers are. Wow. See what the challenges. One of the CEOs we work closely with is in every morning at 5 a.m. talking about, and it helps when you have the CEO at the facilities, right? Sometimes they're very separate. And so you don't realize what's happening in the world, and seeing what the challenges are. Getting people transportation, an enormous issue. You wouldn't think, well, the car broke down, I can't get to work today. How do we really provide those kind of skill sets? So how do you help people kind of manage through through that workflow and that work process? So those areas, they can be really powerful to create the kind of a quality job that you'd want to work at, or you'd want to have friends work at, or your kids work at, or your parents. How do we make that a really good place? It definitely ought to be safe. It ought to have a reasonable and fair salaries as part of it, and ways that people can have an opportunity to have their voice heard and be part of making a difference. And when you get that, that's when the companies really perform well. Those are the companies that did not have the big great resignation. The ones that weren't doing so well have been struggling, and most of those jobs have happened in the front line. So it's in companies' best interest to really make those quality jobs, you say, Ritse.
That's great. Well, I know that we're almost at time, so just want to kind of look at the top lines. There are three key takeaways that we'd love for you to keep in mind. That supporting and protecting frontline workers are not just a moral imperative, but they support the resilience of your companies. There are concrete things that can be done. And if you look in the report, there are ideas and examples of things that can be done. So it's not just an idea, but there are things that can be done today. And then the last thing I'll just say is, this idea of heads that count, let's make that real. let's remember that frontline workers are core to our economy and can be a competitive advantage. So I just want to thank you for the work that you did, Katherine, and Daryl for doing this work. But I just want to make sure before we stop, Daryl, is there anything else that you'd want to quickly add?
No, again, thanks to the Ford Foundation. Thanks to Katherine for all of her work. Thanks for all the companies that participated and the team at Conscious Capital for giving us a chance to share this in a broader audience. We think that's incredibly important, building the awareness of that. And we do encourage everybody to read the report. It's well written, right, Katherine?
Absolutely.
I mean, you can go to it's actually, it's in the chat, but you can also go to CECP.co, no M, .co, as in collaboration, coordination, to kind of read that report. And please do share with us any of the tools that you've seen, any of the solutions that you're seeing, the ideas, so we can make this a movement about how we really can fully engage our frontline workers in the American economy and beyond. So thank you so much.
Great. And I just wanted to thank you, Ritse, Daryl, and Katherine, for your time today. This has been a great discussion. Thank you to everyone who joined as well. I also dropped in the chat a survey. If anybody can take a moment just to provide some feedback for us for future programming, that would be great. Also, if you're new to Conscious Capitalism, you can visit our website, also dropped in the chat. Once again, just thanks to everyone for your time, and we look forward to future discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.